So we're here today with Dr. John Young. He's an environmental specialist at TexDOT. Hello, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to get started. So let's just start with telling us what you do at TexDOT as an environmental specialist, and maybe you should tell us what TexDOT is.
Sure. Well, so TxDOT is the Texas Department of Transportation. We're the state entity that works on all the transportation issues in the state, everything from airports to railroads to driving down the highway. I'm in the Environmental Affairs Division. There are multiple divisions within TxDOT. And within the Environmental Affairs Division, I'm in a group called the Natural Resource Management Section. And our group, in that group, we work to ensure that transportation projects comply with state and federal environmental regulations, as well as we look for opportunities where we can foster stewardship of the human and natural environment. So we're always looking for ways where we can, maybe reduce road impacts on the environment. That's kind of my specialty, and reducing road impacts on wildlife as well, while improving safety for the traveling public.
Okay. You know what? I had no idea that TxDOT had anything to do with air travel or railroads. I honestly thought y'all were just roads that cars drive on. So,
I think a lot of people do.
really? Okay. No, I love this because I always learn so much on these interviews.
Well, it was a bit of a surprise too. When I came over from Parks and Wildlife Department to TxDOT, I was surprised by the depth, breadth, and knowledge of the environmental section. Uh,
Really?
yeah, and all of the different avenues and things that we're engaged in, from not just regulatory compliance, but how we work to ensure that um, natural resources are protected, that we're actively engaged in research, we're actively engaged in habitat restoration. And a lot of people don't realize that we're engaged in all of those type of avenues.
That's neat. That's neat.
Specifically today, probably in that same vein, we want you to talk a little bit about your work with endangered wildcat species. Can you tell us a bit about the cat species that you've studied in the past and what it's looking like going forward?
Sure. So the only endangered cat, federally endangered cat that I've studied is the ocelot. I've looked at other cat species, bobcat, mountain lions, that I've worked with, although neither of those are endangered, and neither are likely to become or be endangered. Right? They're both doing well. I started working on thorn scrub restoration for the ocelot back in 1990 under Dr. Michael Tuis at Texas A&I University. And then I came back to Texas in 2000, where I was hired as the state mammalogist by Parks and Wildlife Department. And I began working with ocelot again, and planting thorn scrub on state and private lands, and also working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery team. I served on the International Committee for Ocelot Translocation, where we developed a plan of how we might move ocelot from Mexico up into Texas, and then how we would do a soft release for them. I moved to TxDOT in 2011, and began working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the FAR district on developing wildlife crossings for ocelot specifically, but then that has slowly grown to where we're working with a lot of other districts on more general wildlife crossing type issues. So places we might have high deer mortality. We're working with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to look at where we might develop an overpass for pronghorn to help with pronghorn. So our program has grown from, I know we're focused on the wildcat, but we're really looking at all the species within Texas, and how our roads affect them and what we can do to kind of offset that. So for the future for ocelot, we've got a number of other additional wildlife crossings that we'll probably put in place in South Texas. We're involved with the Fish and Wildlife Service on both the recovery team and within state translocation team to look at, is there opportunity to establish a new population of ocelot, and then what might be, or how might TxDOT play a role in helping that and assisting with the ocelot recovery.
Speaking of a new population of ocelots, could you tell us a little bit about the populations we've got right now in South Texas and what challenges they might face? It sounds like you've got a rich history working with ocelots. So, what kind of research are you aiming to perform now, and how would it address some of those challenges?
Okay, sure. From what we know, there's only two currently known populations in South Texas. One at Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, down there in Cameron County, and another one in Willacy County on private ranch lands. Both populations are isolated not only from each other, but from populations down in Mexico as well. And that we know from studies that A&M Kingsville has done, have shown that there's a lot lower genetic diversity between the South Texas populations and lower genetic diversity than what is currently in the Mexico populations. So we know that they're isolated, and that type of genetic isolation and loss of genetic diversity can potentially lead to health issues. It just makes your population less stable. Ocelot also have naturally low reproductive rates, right? They reproduce one, maybe two kittens every 12 to 18 months. And you can imagine, ocelot's kind of a small, especially at a kitten stage, and loss of kittens can be an issue. But I think the two biggest things that are affecting ocelot and have affected the ocelot are habitat loss and fragmentation, due to human development. And that includes towns growing larger, ranches becoming smaller as they sell off, and roadways being developed as well. I know that while road mortality is one of the leading causes of ocelot deaths, but that's not necessarily due to the road. That's probably more likely due to habitat loss and fragmentation, right? And the fact that roads are bisecting or are near these populations that are remaining. So, roads are definitely a challenge. How to get an ocelot over or across a road safely is something that we're working on. And I think that's what our research has been aimed at. Getting one of our large efforts that we've undertaken has been aimed at gaining a better understanding of how ocelot use the landscape, right? Trying to predict. So we don't have a lot of animals on the landscape, but we know they move. And we know somewhat of how some of them have moved. But just because ocelot A went one direction doesn't mean that every other ocelot's going to follow what he did, right? They're not issued a roadmap to go safely. So we're looking at how can we predict where ocelot might move. And A&M Kingsville, UT Rio Grande Valley, Texas State University, they've all been involved in different studies aimed at trying to understand, how ocelot are using the landscape, what wildlife crossing structures that we've put out there for ocelot have worked and are functional. Are they being used? If they're being used by what species are they being used by? So we have a lot of research effort that's going on, and we'll be continuing on, because as we're building more crossing structures, we want to see how they're impacting and affecting the environment.
So that's really interesting. There are a bunch of things there that are great segues to my next question. I want, or habitat fragmentation, road mortality, all of these things I think have led several leading agencies in the state to come up with this road crossing idea. Can you, first of all, just for folks who aren't in the state, because road crossings take different forms in different places, can you tell us what they look like here in Texas? And then how do you decide where to put one?
Sure. So, it's funny you asked that, because when I started in with the idea of developing wildlife crossing or road crossing for ocelots, I started off with the idea of there's got to be this perfect size, this perfect shape, this perfect, structure. And as we've done research over the last 10 years or so on how different culverts and structures are used, I'm learning that there isn't really one perfect size. So we have culverts as small as 3 foot by 3 foot that run 100, 120 feet under the roadway, to culverts as wide as 10 by 10 with little wildlife pathways or walkways on them. It's a concrete pathway that allows, where there's water, it allows animals to have a dry passage. And we have them all the way up to bridge structures that can be anywhere from 6 to 10 feet in height, to 50 to several hundred feet long, all depending on what we're trying to cross and how the road can be engineered.
So do they all go underneath?
We currently only have underpass crossings, yes. So we haven't put in an overpass for Ocelot, and the Texas Department of Transportation, we haven't built an overpass for any species to date. There are a couple overpasses that have been built. There's one in San Antonio that was built to connect a parkway or 2 parks that had been isolated and separated for years by the highway. But that was a private led effort through the city. And then there's a new one also underway in Houston, but that again is to allow for human passage. Now, the one in San Antonio does allow for some wildlife passage. You asked about how do we select crossings. So there's a lot that goes into choosing where location is. And in addition to, how are animals moving? So we look at radio telemetry work. We also collect information on road crashes. So that's, if there's a area with high human or high vehicle crashes, we incorporate that into our potential for where we might want to put crossings. Telemetry data, when it's available, is extremely useful. And then we also collect wildlife road mortality data. And all of that comes into play in helping us select our crossing sites. Now, there's also engineering constraints and design constraints that come into play, right? So, if you've got all flat terrain, well, now you have to raise a roadway to create a bridge structure, or maybe raise a roadway to create a culvert. And, the engineers are fond of reminding me that, yes, TexDOT builds roads for people to drive on, but we also build roads for people to drive off of and survive, right? So when you look at the highway and you say, well, why is there this long open median to the right and to the left of take US 77, for example, and that's so vehicles have room to run off and not collide with anything. And if you do go off the roadway, which we hope people never do, you'll be able to survive. You won't hit something or have a crash or collision.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about how wildlife crossing would impact that, and maybe even then bring up litigation issues if a problem came up with it in the it's really way more complicated than just digging a tunnel underneath the highway, I guess.
It absolutely is. It's something that we work very closely with the engineers on, and it helps when we can sit down with our regulatory agency like the Fish and Wildlife Service and explain, hey, I know you want an ocelot crossing right here, or with Parks and Wildlife, hey, we know you want a pronghorn crossing potentially right here, but it fits our road design and our constraints for constructing the road better if we can move over here. And when we've engaged in those conversations with the state and Fish and Wildlife Service, they've been very open to that and whatnot. So it really is a kind of a give and take there on looking at, what's the habitat, what can we do with the road, how can we design and develop, and where's the best location to do that.
Yeah, I guess that's got to be a big cooperative effort between the agencies. Now, how some of the crossings, I think, for ocelots are a few years old maybe now. Have the
Mhm.
cats been using them? Do you have cameras set up where you can find out who's been using them, and have they reduced mortalities, any road mortalities?
So, lots of questions there.
I
Uh,
know, right?
yeah,
Sorry, I just tend to ramble
no
with the
problem.
question.
No, that's no problem. So yes, we have been monitoring our wildlife or our ocelot crossings that we've put up. Currently, we have monitoring efforts that are on State Highway 100, which is the road that runs out to South Padre Island, and a couple other local roads there around the Laguna population, and we're starting our effort on US 77 as well. I'll just say that on our SH 100 project, which is what I have the most recent data for, we've documented over 30,000 animal crossings in a single year. Under,
Wow.
and there's only 5 structures really there, and it has been everything from long-tailed weasels to rattlesnakes and Texas tortoise to one time we had a mountain lion go through our 3x3 culvert. Yeah, the mountain lion was a real surprise. We have had Ocelot use our crossings on FM 106, which is right adjacent to Laguna Escosa. You can imagine one of the challenges of this is there are so few Ocelot, is that how often or how frequently are they going to even encounter a wildlife crossing structure? So there's a bit of that in play here too, but I think we've demonstrated very successfully that they're very important to a number of wildlife species. Some of them aren't federally listed yet, but many are state species of conservation need from Parks and Wildlife Department. You know, we know there are dispersal corridors, and some of these culverts and crossings are in those dispersal corridors. So like SH 100 is potentially a dispersal corridor. Overall, our wildlife road mortalities have decreased on the survey routes that we've done following construction. But we've got too little data on ocelot to determine if our ocelot road mortalities have decreased. What we can say is that since the crossings have gone in on 100 and FM 106, that no ocelot mortality has occurred on either road.
Well, that's
So,
great. I always wonder.
overall, yeah, overall, they're very, very effective.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear. Yeah, I always wonder how long it takes them to figure it out, because certainly for a while, that construction has got to be an area where they are avoiding because there's so much activity there. And then we drive away and expect them to start using it. And I always wonder how long do they kind of go, okay, what's going on over here, and check it out. Do you have any idea?
That's a good question. Yeah. We've had Bobcat using some of the crossings before they're even completed.
Really? Okay,
Yeah,
then.
they're in the middle of construction, and it's a challenge to monitor those crossings, and so we don't normally monitor them while they're under construction. But UTRGV wanted to capture some of the construction photos, and so they left cameras up, and they're showing bobcats, raccoons, other animals moving through those even before the culverts are in place, or construction is only already halfway done. So there are, we often forget that animals are kind of getting more and more used to human activity. When you look at the landscape, there's not very many areas where animals can avoid or completely be away from human activity. And so I think they're open to, or at least we've demonstrated that during construction for a few species, that they're not concerned about what may be going on and dispersing from the area. They're still there. They're still using it. I guess if you think about it, it's like the choice of animals don't really have a choice. They adopt a home range, right? When we have home work done on our home, we have the choice of saying, hey, bathrooms are being remodeled. We're going to go take a hotel room for a month.
Right.
Yeah.
Animals don't have that choice. So when we're constructing a wildlife crossing structure, they don't get to take a break. They're going to still be trying to use that area. And yeah, they still do.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's neat.
It seems like having no documentation of roadkill on that road is huge. Could you could you, I don't know if this is public information, but could you give us a sense of what your mortality rate was on that road for listeners, just to get a sense of like how important these crossings are?
Sure. Well, we don't have a mortality rate, but what we know is that in the 10 years prior to constructing the 5 wildlife crossings, we had a total of 3 ocelot mortalities.
And that's big
So,
for endangered
right. When you're talking
population.
about an endangered species with only
Yeah,
maybe animals left, any mortality is concerning.
right.
Now, you all are biologists, you know that, it was all 3 males. So from that standpoint, from the biology side, that's less of an impact to the population as a whole than if it were females, but it's still of concern. So
Your genetic diversity is getting stopped at that road. The males moving up to new
right,
populations.
right.
That's great. It sounds like so far so good. I know you said they've only been in for a few years now, but great preliminary evidence that they're being used. Do you see TxDOT constructing more wildlife crossings specifically in South Texas for ocelots and, maybe more broadly for other species across the state?
Yeah, no, but we definitely will be. I mean, there's already plans and discussions underway with the Fish and Wildlife Service for State Highway 4 going out to SpaceX. US 281 is also getting a couple of wildlife crossings geared toward, ocelot. And this is kind of sort of looking forward. Where a lot of folks don't realize as well is when TexDOT undertakes reconstruction or design or redesigning a large roadway like US 281 or US 77, it is going to be that way for the next 20, 30 years. So, when we offered to put wildlife crossings on US 281, that's trying to look 30 years into the future and hoping that ocelot will move from east of 77 to between 77 and 281, and then hopefully further west and get west of 281. Right. So having to plan well into the future, even though currently there's no evidence of a population between those 2 roads. Right. So looking forward, we have a lot of crossing structures coming in. And then we've also started an interdivisional team within TxDOT working on when and where we might put in wildlife crossings. So we're looking at both existing roadways and how we might, do existing bridges, allow for wildlife passage, terrestrial passage. If they don't, can they be modified? How might we modify them? And we're looking at new location roadways too. And all of this isn't just aimed at, reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, but it's really aimed at improving safety for the traveling public. We know when people collide with deer because it's usually catastrophic enough that there's a crash report filed. But I don't think anybody wants to admit that the reason that they drove off the road was they swerved to avoid a skunk, right? I mean, I don't. And I think that that's a big piece, is that we're trying to address that safety for people while reducing our wildlife vehicle collisions, because wildlife vehicle collisions can be quite catastrophic and dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of the future construction is keeping in mind the hopeful reintroduction and reestablishment of ocelots in South Texas and, connecting habitat where they might exist. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And we're looking at a couple of other efforts that we would undertake too with the Fish and Wildlife Service to try and look at beyond the road. So one of our challenges is most of our mitigation opportunities are within that linear stretch of roadway. So how can we work with the service or work with others to affect habitat restoration leading up to one of the road crossings, right? Because we're only within that 400 or 300 foot right of way that we're actively working. So how do we work with the refuge if they're adjacent, or how do we work with the private landowner if they're adjacent to us, to improve their habitat, to improve use of our wildlife crossing structure.
It's a big collaborative effort. This is fantastic, though, to hear that this is hopefully coming down the pipeline, more of this sort of work. So it's great.
We're hopeful. We're hopeful. We really are.
So there's another species of cat that you didn't mention, and to be honest, I'd never heard of the cat before I came to Texas, the jaguarundi. Do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts about their sort of potential reintroduction and how they may or may not use these road crossings as well? And also maybe give our listeners just a background on what a jaguarundi is.
Okay. So a jaguarundi is a small neotropical cat that reached its northernmost distribution ever in the very far south part of Texas. So it's not a surprise most people haven't heard of the jaguarundi. This is the only place where it would occur, probably the bottom 3 counties in the state. And like I said, that would have been its northernmost distribution, so it may not have had real robust populations up here. We don't know. We don't know a whole lot about jaguarundi. It's a pretty well understudied cat. There have been a few studies in Mexico that kind of inform us, that tell us, hey, they're kind of in the same habitat as ocelot, but they're using it a little bit differently, and they're using some habitats that ocelot don't. But with our current state of knowledge, we feel that if we're addressing ocelot, then we're likely also addressing jaguarundi. One of the interesting things about jaguarundi is folks don't realize how small they are. Are a small cat. They only weigh about 8 to 10 pounds.
Oh, that's tiny.
Yeah, they are small.
The house cat's bigger than that. A lot of
they're house cat size. Actually, some house cats are much larger. When I was in the Parks and Wildlife Department, most of the photos that I got that folks were sending me to ask if it was a jaguarundi were house cat. And that's because they're similar size. The difference is they have a really unique shape, and they've got a long, thick tail.
Okay.
They may be 2 feet, 24, 30 inches long, but it's almost all in their tail. Their tail's almost as long as their body, if not a little bit longer. And in Mexico, they're sometimes called otter cats because their overall shape is very much like an otter. They're taller in the hind legs than they are in the front. Their head and neck are very symmetrical, so they don't have a real definitive change in diameter from the head to the neck, which is very otter-like as well. Been a lot of sightings reported of jaguarundi in Texas, but sightings are unreliable. A lot of those sightings have been outside their known historical range. I think Parks and Wildlife has just recently, and also I worked with A&M Kingsville and some co-authors on a publication where we calling into question, are jaguarundi even still in the state, or are they extirpated from Texas? And extirpated just means that they're not here. They're extinct with it, or they're extirpated from a piece of their range locally. So they're down south in Mexico, but they aren't here any longer, we feel, and so does Parks and Wildlife Department. And that's important from the standpoint of, if we're trying to recover jaguarundi, if we want to recover jaguarundi, are the efforts that we're putting in place for them really beneficial, or should we be looking to other avenues for restoration? And it's really hard to determine if a species is locally extirpated, right? Think of all of the birds or animals that people thought were gone, and then all of a sudden, boom, hey, here's a white-cheeked pintail that showed up, or remember the ivory-billed woodpecker, right? And folks all of a sudden said, hey, we saw one, and they had what they thought was evidence, which has since been called into question. So there have been lots of folks who've submitted photos and whatnot, but I think the last known jaguarundi was in 1986
Okay.
state. So, when do you consider a species extirpated? 50 years, 70 years, 100 years? And it's an animal that can move, right? So, if they're only 100 kilometers south or 80 miles south, how much effort would it take for one to potentially come up and over the border? It'd be a difficult journey, and it's there's no indication that they would travel that far, but animals are very difficult to predict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've touched on a few things. You've sort of teased about a few things, but can you tell us about what is there any good news on the horizon for either ocelots or jaguarundis, or just endangered cats in Texas, in general?
Yeah, I think there is. I'm looking at, TexDOT will continue to plan for additional wildlife crossing structures in South Texas. That is going to help to connect habitat that's bisected or fragmented by roads. We're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service on developing an in lieu fee program that would enable our projects that might impact habitat that are away from where ocelot or jaguarundi may occur, to bringing that mitigation over to where it could benefit ocelot. So this is one of the avenues that we're approaching, to be able to say, we want to provide for habitat restoration over near the Laguna population. How do we do that? Well, we have a road project out in far western Starr County, that we're going to take some brush. There's no indication that ocelot are there, but we want to mitigate for our brush impacts. And so we may be able to pay into an in lieu fee program, and then those monies could be spent to restore habitat where the populations are. And that's in progress. What else have we got going on? Yeah, we're also working with the Fish and Wildlife Service on revising translocation of ocelot from Mexico and within Texas as well. So I think those are all going to be potentially positive steps that'll help the ocelot and jaguarundi.
That sounds great. For your translocation plans, is it to bulk up the already occurring populations that we've got here, or you're envisioning maybe additional populations further down the line?
So that's still being worked out, right? And I can tell you, though, that historically, when we were looking at translocation, it was aimed at augmenting the existing populations to improve their genetic diversity. But over the last decade or so, the ideas for that have also evolved to saying we do need to take a harder look at new areas and establishing potentially new populations. How that may go about and how that may look has a long way to go before it can happen. But it is definitely one of the goals for the translocation projects.
That's really great news for ocelots, for sure.
That's exciting.
So there's probably some listeners that might be interested in working with wild cats in their future for their career. Do you have any advice on how they could go about maybe getting a foot in the door or getting some experience?
Sure. So I think it's important to recognize when you're in an undergraduate program that you go introduce yourself to your major advisor, go meet your wildlife professors. Yeah, it's going to be 2 years till you have too many classes with them because of the way the university structure goes. But there are opportunities within the school for you to work with graduate students. And that's going to help get you experience. It's going to let professors know that you're excited and want to get involved with programs. I mean, during my undergraduate degree, I got to go out and radio track foxes for a PhD student, and I was involved with food habits of raccoons. And some things are going to be weird, like an endangered snail survey, right? So right there, by the time I graduated, I had non-game species, game species, and, field lab experience working in a laboratory with the food habits. And I got paid for that. And I think that's something that students overlook. There's also, now, even more so than when I was in school, opportunities for field work abroad, right? So look at those scholarship opportunities, look at those field abroad opportunities. And, I get it, they can be expensive because you're not going to get paid for some of those, but, they offer an opportunity for you to get involved and get engaged. Yeah, and then just in general, go to your graduate advisor or, one of the other professors and ask, do you need assistance? Can I get involved? And be prepared that it might just simply be, okay, you're going to enter data for us, or, hey, we need somebody to clean, the ocelot traps. And the reward, it will be, okay, you've cleaned, 200 of our ocelot traps and helped get everything together. Now you can come out with us and set the traps, right? And that will be the reward side of things. And then I think as far as when you decide to go for an advanced degree, regardless of what your GPA may say or your scores on your different tests may say, be patient. Don't let anybody tell you you don't have an opportunity. You better take the first thing that comes along. Wait for a project that interests you, right? Because you're going to live, eat, breathe, and sleep that master's or PhD for the next 2 to 4 to 6 years. And you want it to be something that you want to do and are highly interested in, because it isn't just about, your grades. It's also about sticking to it and completing things, right? It's pushing through that. I measured 12,000 brush seedlings one time a month for a year, right? That was what my ocelot habitat restoration project included. And then analyzing that, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't a lot of fun going out there in 100-degree days and measuring things, but I finished it and I got my master's degree with it. So sticking, making a commitment and sticking to it is a big piece as well.
I think that's really great advice. Thank you for sharing that.
I'd rather have somebody that I know is just gonna stick to it without complaining than somebody with straight A's as an undergrad. Because it's just more an exercise in perseverance than anything else.
That was, yes, I would say that is exactly what it is, an exercise in perseverance.
Yeah.
So endangered species are a serious topic, but when you're working outdoors and with wildlife, it can also be a lot of fun. And our signature question here at a talk on the wild side is about biology blunders. Can you tell us about a time when everything went wrong and you ended up with a funny story?
Sure. First thing I will say is whenever you're working around water, make sure that you check the water depth. So, and this leads into my story. We were relocating bats from a bridge in the Beaumont area, which is up in the eastern part of the state. And we had learned over time, or thought at the time, that waiting until the winter time when temperatures would go low, your bat numbers are going to be down, because bats will migrate further south. Even our Brazilian free-tailed bats that like to stay around will move in between roosts, and numbers will be lower. And it makes extracting them and relocation easier when they're in torpor, right? They're not trying to run away from you. They're kind of half asleep and they're easy to scoop out. And I think the first thing that we noticed was when I got to the site, I was handed a step ladder, not a cherry picker, a step ladder. And, we got in the water and there was silt. So now I'm sinking, knee deep into mud with the step ladder. So the first challenge was, what can we do to keep the step ladder from sinking? So we put it on a piece of plywood. Then I had to have 2 people stabilize the ladder on the plywood so I could climb up and try to pull the bats out. And that became a challenge because I'm working directly overhead. right? I didn't have a lot of area where I could move. But everything worked out fine. You know, we overcame those issues. We got through that. We got bats out. I had them all in the nice little sack. I was in my waders, and we went down to the nearby bridge where we were going to put the bats in. And I stepped on the slope, which was concrete, right? A concrete slope right there at the bridge. And I got like 6-8 steps out, and I started to slide. And I had glanced at the water when I went in here, and the water was shallow. It looked shallow, right? I could see the bottom. Well, I went off the edge of that, expecting to, you know, get wet to my knees, and I went completely underwater.
Oh my
Oh my
gosh.
gosh.
And it's funny because the people I was with, they were like, you know, they panicked because all that's left floating on top is my hard hat. Apparently, I rebounded and came back up after I hit the bottom and came up directly under my hard hat. Bats coming up first. That was one of the coworkers was like, "Man, you brought the bats up first." I'm like, "Well, of course, you know, I wasn't worried about me. I'm more worried about them. I'm not going to drown." And yeah, it took a little bit of time to crawl back up. And you know what had happened was during high water flow that there had been a scour hole there, and I slipped and fell into that. So you know, we were successful. We dried the bats off. I got dried off. I was fortunate my waders were neoprene, so you know they were buoyant. They didn't fill and weight me down, which I real trouble. If I'd have had on loose fitting, you know, rubber waders, they would have filled and probably held me down, and I'd have been in a little bit more trouble then. But
no.
Yeah, it was probably 6-8 feet of water that I.
Wow. Your bats got a little bit of a bath that night.
They did. And you know, the funny thing is when you dry them off, they become much more active. You dry them off and get them warmed up, they're ready to go out and spend the evening foraging or whatever. So yeah, we had to they were a little more tougher to put in to relocate and put back up into the gap once they became awake and dry and warm. So.
That's wild. You got to wonder sometimes what the wildlife is thinking. They're just like, we were just hanging out here. They're telling a buddy, we were just hanging out here. Somebody grabs us, puts us in a bag, then they duck us underwater. Then they take us out and they put us underneath this bridge. I don't know where I am now. And what was the point of the water? And the whole, you know, that's probably what you just have to wonder what's going on in those little heads.
Yeah. Well, you know, fortunately, this one, we figured that the bats were moving between the roosts because they were only, you know, 60-80 feet apart.
Sure.
Oh, nice.
And we just assumed that they were doing that. And, you know, it was very successful. The bridge got replaced. And before the bridge even got reopened, bats came back and occupied the new bridge structure. So
oh, nice.
It worked out very well for us. Yeah.
That's cool. And they have a neat alien abduction story to tell their friends.
Yes.
Very cool.
Isn't all wildlife relocation kind of an alien?
Yeah. That's really neat. So is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think the thing that I'd like to share would be that, you know, we are the Texas Department of Transportation, but one of our goals is to foster stewardship by protecting our natural resources. And, you know, while we spent this time talking about how crossings might impact the ocelot population, they're really put in there as well for the safety of the traveling public, right? We're really trying to keep animals off the roads, and it is a safety issue for people. And, you know, I would just remind folks that when you're driving down the highway, TexDOT does a lot of other efforts like planting wildflowers and using native seed mix in our rights of ways. You know, we spend time consulting with the state and federal agencies to try to make sure that the actions that we're taking are addressing issues that need to be addressed for the species, and also, you know, that we're using state dollars wisely.
Mm-hmm.
And we conduct and support everything from plant and animal surveys to land acquisition efforts to research projects. So we're a much more varied entity than I think what most people think. It's not just about building roads to get people from one place to the other, although that is the primary objective.
Sure. That's so interesting. And I have to say that Texas is one of the prettiest places to travel through in the spring and early summer because of all the wildflowers. It's just so fantastic. It makes driving down the road so much more pleasant than just looking at grass, don't you think?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yeah. I love that. I love that y'all plant wildflowers everywhere. That's terrific. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about TexDOT that I
Yeah.
didn't know. That's so, I don't know. It's just so exciting to see all these things that you have your hand in. Pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, when I came here to work for the agency, it was a real surprise at
Yeah.
how engaged in natural resource protection and management that the road transportation agency was, right?
Mm.
So the transportation agency was, yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much
Yeah,
and
thank
have a
you.
great afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Okay. Oh, remember, don't feed the wildlife.